Hey everyone, it's James and it is October, and what better time of year than right now to pick up a copy of my brand new book, Adirondack Campfire Stories, Tales and Folklore from Inside the Blue Line. It's the spooky season, and now is the perfect time to read this book around the campfire. So pick it up wherever you buy books, Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, or you could get it from your local bookstore. You can just request it. So this year's October Sessions is brought to you by my book, Adirondack Campfire Stories, Tales and Folklore from Inside the Blue Line. If you like stories set in the Adirondack high peaks and all around the park, this is the book for you. Check it out. Spooky stories, light a fire, make some s'mores, and enjoy the ride. All right, let's get into the 5th annual October Sessions. This is the 46 of 46 podcast October Sessions, where we'll talk all things spooky Adirondacks and more. From Bigfoot encounters on the NPT to ghostly sightings in the trees. We'll dive deep into the heart of these mountains and the people who dare to climb them. From Adirondack Bigfoots to haunted lakeside bark huts. It's all here on the 46 of 46 October Sessions. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 5th annual October Sessions right here on the 46 of 46 podcast. Can you believe it? October is here, and with that comes fall and campfires and leaves and spooky season. It is the 5th season of doing these October Sessions, and they're some of my favorite episodes of the year. And kicking us off on the right foot, we are going to talk about Bigfoot. Yes, this is going to be Bigfoot in the Blue Line Part 5. And my guest this week is Emily from the Forest Fleur Podcast. She is a Bigfoot researcher who has fallen in love with the Adirondacks. I had the privilege of being on her podcast years ago, and she's on here tonight to talk all about Bigfoot and Bigfoot in the Blue Line in particular with me right here on the 46 of 46 podcast. So let's get the October Sessions kicked off. Emily, welcome to the 46 of 46 podcast.
Thanks, James. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm super happy to have you here. I always start the October Sessions with a Bigfoot episode because I'm just super into the subject, which you know full well. And it's just the one episode a year I get to pretend I'm a Bigfoot podcaster, which is what you do on your podcast. But before we get too into Bigfoot, give us a little bit of a background about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your story and then how eventually you got into obviously the subject of Bigfoot, but then you took it one step further. You have a whole platform revolving around it. So talk a little bit about that and then kind of how the Adirondacks came into play for you.
Sure. Yeah. I've been interested in Bigfoot, pretty much my whole life. I used to watch documentaries like Monster Quest and, other sort of shows like that with my mom. And she always told me that my grandfather believed in Bigfoot and he had passed away. So it was kind of my way of still feeling close to him as I grew up. And whenever we would watch these shows or documentaries, my mom would say, your grandfather believed that these things were out there. But it wasn't until I was about 12 or 13 that I really started diving into it a little further. I, was crafty at the time, and sort of my little ritual would be to, craft something and put something on TV. And at the time, there was no Netflix or Hulu, right? You had to dig out the DVDs. And my parents had this big DVD pack of horror films and really scary content. And so I, flipped through them and I found a disc that said The Legend of Bigfoot. And so I said, Bigfoot, I like watching things about that. So popped it in. Turns out it was Ivan Marks, The Legend of Bigfoot. And it was such a hokey, silly documentary sort of style movie where he was in the Pacific Northwest and he was telling you about Bigfoot and searching for it. And then at the end of the film, there are some costumes. They're not real Sasquatch, but they looked real to me when I was 12, right? So I got just so excited. And I said to my parents, can we go somewhere that has Bigfoot? we always look to take a small little family trip every year. I grew up just outside of New York City. So, I begged them, can we go somewhere where there's Bigfoot? And just so happened around the same time, my grandparents had acquired a summer home in the Adirondacks, actually in the foothills of the Adirondacks. And my grandmother had found out about Whitehall, New York. And Whitehall is famous for a Sasquatch sighting involving law enforcement in the 70s. And so I begged my parents, my grandmother told me about this. I said, guys, we've got to go to Whitehall. It was about a 6-hour drive from where I lived, and we all piled into the car, and I somehow convinced them to take this rugged vacation, right? We're not hiking people. We're not outdoors people. We're in New York City, right? We're not used to this, but we drove up and we arrived in Whitehall, and it was this spooky little, beautiful, desolate town with gorgeous views. And right there in the middle of town was a huge Bigfoot statue. And I wandered into the local museum, spoke to the curator there. He let me know, where the Bigfoots were coming from, where he thought that they were hiding out. He showed me a map, and in the display case was a hand-carved small little Sasquatch for sale. And I bought it, of course, as a souvenir. And every single day since that trip, I would just look at that statue and think, oh my gosh, I just had no idea that there were Bigfoot in New York State. I thought it was more of a West Coast thing. And it just blew my mind as a kid. So as I got older, I, went to college. I went to a fashion school and studied business and product development there. And while everyone was doing their projects on purses and clothing, and I said, you know what, let me be a little different. I'll do my projects on Bigfoot. So all my research papers were, Sasquatch, and it was received really well by a lot of my classmates and professors. And I noticed a lot of the people, who went to my school were all, city people, New York metro area residents, and everyone seemed to be really interested in Bigfoot. And after researching it, I found out that there was actually science behind it. And when I would communicate that to my classmates or my teachers, everybody was really interested in learning more. And one of my professors said, you should really kick this up and make this into an organization. You're really good at educating people about this. It's an interesting topic. And at the time, I was kind of pitching a model where I would have information on Bigfoot and then souvenirs to fund my research. And, my professor inspired me to sort of start the Forest Fleur. And from there, it just grew tremendously. I mean, I started podcasting during the pandemic and gained a lot of stories that way, a lot of connections in the Bigfoot field. Spoke to a lot of really amazing people, including Peter Byrne, right, one of the pioneering Bigfoot researchers. Got really close with other researchers, asked questions to people like Dr. Jeff Meldrum, and I just learned everything I could about Sasquatch. And so shortly after that, I said, I really want to apply my knowledge, that I've read in all these books to the field, but I don't know where to start. So I took a trip out to Oregon, spent 3 months out there learning from some really amazing researchers out there, had my own experiences, and came back to New York State. Something that was pretty interesting and involves the Adirondacks is when I was out in Oregon, I heard vocalizations clear as day in the Mount Hood National Forest. And what was really interesting about it is it sparked this memory in me that I have from Lake George. In 2017, I went to Prospect Mountain on a hike. It was in the off season, so there was pretty much no one around. And because I was the only one on the trail, my friend and I at the time, I said to him, hey, why don't we do some Sasquatch calls just to practice? And he's like, okay, there was no one around and it was the perfect time to do it, right? I'm at the time I was living just outside New York City. You can't practice Sasquatch calls, in the middle of the road there, right? So we're in a desolate area. We're on this trail. And I said, let's practice. So I started howling and I heard a response. And so, at the time, I was just getting into Bigfooting, and I was like, this is weird. I think that's a Bigfoot, but I can't be sure. But going out west really reaffirmed that, because I really did hear them out west. And it sounded exactly like the one I heard on Prospect Mountain in Lake George in 2017. So interesting that my, research out there sort of validated that there are Sasquatch here in New York as well. So all the pieces started coming together for me. And, recently I've just been working on learning everything I can about the Adirondacks, creating some maps, and, really starting to dive into my research in, the Blue Line area.
Hi, my name's Casey. I'm from Rochester, New York. I came across James' 46 of 46 podcast, started listening to everything he had to say, really liked the recount of the 46 high peaks, and that's really what triggered me very last minute to jump into his Great Range Athlete program. I hadn't been working out for 2 years or so and really wanted to get back into working out and needed a routine and a program, and James offered exactly what I was looking for, something to get into mountain shape. Working with a team of 15 others, meeting weekly, it was great. And I found myself aligning mentally with James, and knew he had a lot more to offer than just that program. So I signed up for the Seek to Do More program, and it has been life-changing for me. Realigning my thoughts and my life, identifying with the person that I want to be, setting habits and through the daily commitments, and really honing in and starting to take action in my life. I have not felt this good. It has been a long time since I have felt as good as I do now, both physically and mentally. So thank you, James, very much.
If you're feeling like Casey was just a few months ago and you need a little spark in your life, you need to throw a log on the fire so that you can improve your physical fitness, so that you can have the outdoors adventures you want to have, and you need a little help building that disciplined, resilient mindset so that you can become the strongest version of yourself, both on and off the trail, the Seek to Do More program might be exactly what you're looking for. You don't have to go through life feeling like you have untapped potential. Instead, we can awaken that sleeping giant inside of you. All it takes is taking action, just like Casey did. If you want to learn a little bit more about the Seek to Do More program and what I do with people to see if it's right for you, just send me a DM on social media or email me at james@46outdoors.com. Happy to talk to you about it so that we can get you moving in the right direction so that you can become the absolute strongest version of yourself in the mountains and in your life. Your story is very organic in how it started, and then it just slowly, evolved like a snowball, one piece after another, and here you are today. So for starters, I love that you took a different approach with your school in terms of the business that you're doing versus what other people were doing. So props and kudos to you on being a little different, and also making it very true to yourself. You went after a subject that you find interesting, and people probably laugh and chuckle, but whatever. We all like what we like, and you didn't let that stop you from moving forward. So I think that's awesome. I also think it's neat that the fellow students and even professors were actually very receptive to this idea that you have. I think that's really fascinating, actually.
Yeah, I was honestly shocked by their reactions. I mean, there were a handful of people that kind of poo-pooed it, but sure. For the most part, I've had a really great experience with it. And I think that when you grow up in a place where Sasquatch is not really talked about a lot, when people find out that there's more to it than just stories, I think it really sort of draws people in, and, they want to learn more about it. And that's sort of where my sweet spot is, because, there are a lot of researchers out there who talk about Sasquatch, a lot of podcasts, social media content. But some people tend to paint Bigfoot in a negative way. And, they sort of invoke fear surrounding Sasquatch. And so my thought is, if I can be the first person to introduce certain people to the subject, I can educate them with the facts and the right information, and they're going to get it from me rather than a source that might be unreliable or someone that's hoaxing, right? So that's sort of the goal.
Absolutely. No, I see your I see your platform. I've listened to your podcast. You take a very level-headed approach to it, and I think it's very refreshing that you take such a level-headed approach to it. And for people who don't know, like Bigfoot is the type of subject where when you go down the rabbit hole, you don't need to go very far to see like, whoa, there is something more to this subject that I never knew. But you don't have to go far to realize that and to see like, holy cow, there's so many people who have had so many encounters all over the country and the world, honestly, but we'll talk about the country here. And you didn't expect them to be in New York State. You know, most people wouldn't realize that it's like the vast majority of Sasquatch encounters that are reported are in Ohio and Texas, of all places. Like you wouldn't expect it to be in places like that. Everyone in their mind, just like you did, thinks Northwest, West Coast, right out there. But and then you think like New York State, because most people just think of the city when they think of New York State. Obviously, the Adirondacks, if you know, you know, but if you don't know, you don't know. So it's very neat to see here how that story of your whole platform has evolved. And you're a player. You've got a following now, and you're doing what you're looking to do. So again, kudos to you on taking action and actually making it happen. It's cool. You have a nice, unique vibe to your page too on social media. You have a very specific look to it, and it's very consistent. So I give you again props to that. But you're a design person by nature, so that's clearly on purpose. So it's noticeable, though. I will give you that. It's noticeable.
Thank you.
So now, a lot of people listening to the podcast are probably like, man, they're talking about Bigfoot like it's this factual thing. And obviously you're going to get that a lot. We obviously both believe that 100% these are what are out in the woods. So take me through what you say to the people who come up to you and they might like chuckle a little bit about the subject. What's your approach? And I have my own approach as well. What's your approach under those circumstances?
Yeah, I would say, there are a lot of skeptics out there, and I talk to a lot of them frequently. I think the biggest thing that we can do is educate them on the physical evidence that does exist, right? There are many theories about what Bigfoot is, where they came from. Personally, I believe that they are a biological animal. Some people think that there's a spiritual element to them, which is, entirely possible. But I think in terms of a skeptic, a good place to start is the physical evidence. So I like to run them through footprints first. So I actually have one here I can show you.
Awesome.
So here is a footprint from the Patterson-Gimlin film site. This was taken about 9 days after the film was shot. And in the middle of the footprint, you see this indent, which kind of looks a little bit like an arch, but it's actually not an arch. It's called a mid-tarsal break, which indicates midfoot flexibility. So really what this means is that when a Sasquatch stepped, their weight was shifted differently than, say, a human's weight would be when we take a step. And it causes a little mound of dirt to build up in the ground. And when we cast the print, because it's a negative of the print, the cast shows it as an indent. But really, it was the foot kind of pushing up a little bit of dirt as it took that step and shifted its weight. And that's because the foot is very flexible in the middle. We also have hair samples that support the existence of Sasquatch. Although we can't extract DNA from them because it's very hard to extract DNA from primate hair, including humans, the hair structure resembles that of a chimpanzee and a human. So that's another piece of evidence I always like to tell people about. And the third piece of evidence would be fingerprints. A lot of times in these footprint and handprint casts, we find what are called dermal ridges, which are the unique lines on the pads of our fingers. Dermal ridges are unique to primates and koala bears. So that's something that's really interesting because it sort of points to Sasquatch maybe being an ape species. And so when I start to run people through the evidence, they start to kind of put together a picture and they say, okay, well, Emily, are you saying Sasquatch is an ape? Because all of this evidence sort of points to that. And I always tell people, Sasquatch has forward-facing eyes, they are hair-covered, and they have no tail. Those are characteristics of an ape. They also exhibit behavior like bluff charging, whooping, whistling. Those are characteristics of apes. behavioral characteristics. And so when you really think about what Sasquatch is, we can start with the basics. They probably are some sort of North American ape. But people get really insulted when I say that because they say, well, I had an encounter with one and it seemed like it was so much smarter than an ape. And that's where we get into the debate on, more human-like versus more ape-like, because humans are technically apes, right? Depending on, some people who are more spiritual or religious may believe something else, totally okay. But what the scientific community tells us is, humans are apes. And so when you really think about what Sasquatch could be, there were over 20 species of apes that lived on this earth millions of years ago, and they were called hominoids. And hominoids, some of them buried their dead, some of them used tools, many of them walked upright on two legs. And so there are all sorts of species of ape called hominoids that once existed on this earth, and they all had varying degrees of intelligence. But I usually like to tell people, when we classify Sasquatch, right, if we find a body, that hasn't so much decomposed yet, it may be easier for us to classify them, and we may be able to do it record of all of these hominoid species that we have fossils for. They were only classified by their physicality because we didn't have brains that we could analyze. It was only their bones that were left behind. So whenever I tell people that Sasquatch might be an ape or they might be a hominoid, I think it's important to remember that they will likely be characterized, named based on not their intelligence.
Unbelievable. Very articulate and very well spoken. Like I said, you're very level-headed about your explanation of the subject. So I wanted to hear that, and I wanted the listeners to hear that too, that you can have a conversation about this subject and it not be all, woohoo, it can just be like, let's just have a real conversation about things that people are seeing and things that people are actually researching and studying, like credible people. You talked about, you've met Jeff Meldrum, who is probably like, the big dog of the world of Bigfoot, though from what it sounds like from what other people say about him is that he wouldn't want to be considered that necessarily, but like he kind of is, right. Kind of by default, but he gives it a bit of credibility, the whole conversation. So there's so many subjects we could talk about real quick, but let's talk a little bit real quick before we move into like more Adirondack-y stuff. So you had mentioned that, there's theories of where Bigfoot falls, and you fall into the category of, and we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, you fall into the category of primate, ape, biological creature, which is where I started when I first was into the subject. To me, it was like, oh, it's just like a monkey in the woods we just haven't necessarily caught up with. And then as I've, explored the subject, listened to the podcast, watched the show, gone down the rabbit holes, I have found that my thought process on Bigfoot now is that it is biological and something else, which is why it's such a crazy topic, a crazy subject that's hard to explain. So that only comes from listening to just so many stories and hearing like, well, there are these weird things that are happening with it. So I can't discredit that. So talk to me about why you find yourself in your kind of camp. Cause there's typically like, is it more like paranormal camp? Is it more totally biological? Whereas I kind of fall like, I think it's both. So you find on the biological. So talk to me about how you kind of landed at that, that camp, we'll say, and then we'll talk, we'll continue the conversation.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, I would say, the number one thing to consider here is none of us are experts on Sasquatch, right? Totally. So, even if you ask somebody who's done a ton of field work, who's done a ton of research, right? We still really don't know what they are because we haven't discovered them yet. So, we can really only go off of the evidence that we have. And then I think it is really fun to kind of expand on that and see where that takes us, right? But the reason that I fall more into the biological camp is just because, when I look at the physical evidence, that's really all we have, stories and physical evidence. When I look at the physical evidence, I sort of think to myself, there are some theories of Sasquatch being interdimensional. It's certainly possible. I don't think we know enough about that sort of thing to, be able to research it unless we found something that was interdimensional, right? Then we could study it and measure things. But for me, I think the evidence that I see, like footprints, hair samples, and dermal ridges, are physical features of a biological animal, and they're so close to other biological animals that walk this earth, like humans and apes, that for me, I just feel that for now, I'm going to stick with that because that's something that I can measure. It's something that I can compare with other species that exist. I can look at how chimpanzees and gorillas behave and orangutans and even gibbons, and I can sort of compare that to Sasquatch behavior, right? It's measurable, it's comparable. When we start getting into paranormal or interdimensional or, extraterrestrial, those are sort of topics that are very hard to research, record, document, dig into, right? Because in our world as it is, we don't know a lot about those things. So I tend to stick with the biological. I also find that, just me personally, I've heard some stories where people say Sasquatch disappeared before my eyes, or, why haven't we found them yet? They must be interdimensional, or they must be, be able to disappear. And I think that they do have the ability to disappear. I just think that it's a biological feature rather than something else, because I think apes in general are very elusive, and, they are very easily concealed. You look at Dr. Jane Goodall's work, which I've studied quite a bit. I have a book of hers, and I said, let me dig into this because I really want to know how she found this group of chimps and got so close to them that she was able to study them, because that's really something I'd like to do with Sasquatch. And it turns out it took her a little over a year to actually get close enough to the chimps to be able to take notes and study them. And for most of that time, she was looking through binoculars. So it took her several years to really gain their trust. And it took her a few months to even find the colony of chimps. So I think apes in general are pretty elusive. And that's kind of why I stick towards the biological camp. But with that being said, I certainly find some of the other theories interesting, right? Because you look at Whitehall, New York, and there was a big boom in Sasquatch sightings during a couple of years in the 70s. And around that same time, there was also a UFO boom. And researcher Paul Bartholomew sort of takes the two and says there must be some sort of correlation, because they were happening at the same time. Definitely respect that idea, because as researchers, we have to look for, patterns and consistencies, and, we have to sort of put two and two together. But I guess my thought also is if somebody saw a UFO and saw a fox, they wouldn't put the two together. But if they saw a UFO and then a Sasquatch, they might marry the two. So I'm a little skeptical. I've never really come across evidence that's compelled me enough to dig into some of those other theories, but I don't think that we should dismiss them. And I think it's important that there are people out there studying them, because that way we cover all our bases. And if there is something that comes out of that, we can start digging into that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a rabbit hole subject. You go down and you learn about this, you learn about that. Like I told you before, I never knew that there were these theories of, the UFO, and then there's the other theories of it being paranormal, and then the orbs, and like the longer or the further you go down the rabbit hole, you see, wow, there's a lot of talks about this subject, and these theories are developed because of people's encounters and experiences, over and over and over again. So it's a fascinating subject. Paul Bartholomew was actually the guest on the very first Bigfoot in the Blue Line episode 5 years ago.
Awesome.
He was here on the podcast to talk about Bigfoot and the ADK a little bit. It was awesome. Going with what you were just talking about with the theories with UFOs. So every year the Darn Tough puts out a sock with a Bigfoot on it. And last year they had a sock with a UFO and a beam coming down with a Bigfoot, like coming out of the beam of light. And I said to myself, I said, man, whoever designed this sock this year has like a more in-depth understanding of at least the world and the theories behind Bigfoot to piece the two together. Found that fascinating. But yeah, I kind of myself fall on this, like it's biological because people have killed it. People have reported killing it. People have reported seeing it eat, which obviously like something paranormal is not going to be doing. And then and then you have the other things, like the weirder, unexplainable things, like you just said, like people saying it disappeared before their very eyes, or people saying, you know, all the other paranormally type of stuff. So for me, it's like, man, I guess this is one of those subjects that we'll just never understand, which is why I say it is biological and then some, because that to me, it kind of helps explain it a little bit, because it's just such a wild subject. Now you mentioned too, other apes or other hominids, you said, burying their dead. And that's always been my theory. People are like, where are the bodies? They bury them. To me, it seems like the most simple, logical, easiest answer, that a creature, an animal, wherever line you fall in, wherever camp you fall in, would be able to do that. And so to me, that's a very obvious answer. What's your take on where are the dead bodies?
That's a great question and a really interesting topic to discuss. And I think, James, I think you're going to agree with me on this, right? When you think about the food chain, you have maybe, 1,000 deer in this valley. And then maybe you have 200 bobcats. Maybe you have 100 mountain lions. Maybe you have 50 bears, right? As you get up on the predator scale, there are less and less individuals within that group because they have a higher caloric intake. They need more food sources. They cannot compete with each other. Sasquatch seems to be at the top chain. People have seen them hunting. People have seen them gathering, right? And these are massive, massive animals, and they are very elusive, and they probably are endangered. So when I think about Sasquatch, there are probably maybe 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 of them in one valley, circulating around. And so when you think about those numbers, right? I mean, when was the last time you saw a dead bear in the woods?
Totally.
People tend to say, well, where are the bodies? Well, are you out looking for them? Because nobody really is, right? And so, even bear biologists who are out there looking for bear remains, it's still really hard to find those, right? So, when you get a smaller and smaller population, it becomes harder to find them. That's number one. Number two, Sasquatch tend to live in temperate rainforests, and the Adirondacks can sort of be considered a temperate rainforest. It has a higher amount of rainfall than some other places. And when you have an area with high rainfall, you have soil types and fungus that down body very and I'm curious. Study farm in Indiana used to determine how fast corpses can decompose, and they use that to solve crimes. And this body farm had a 1,000-pound pig that decomposed within 3 days. And that was just with the influence of a blowfly, which is a species of fly in Indiana. And so that was just the fly. They didn't take into account other scavengers and, fungus and all that. And so when you really think about it, like if you have a 1,200-pound Sasquatch, maybe give it a week and that corpse is gone, or at least it's not identifiable. That's number two. Number three, they absolutely could bury because the way that they interact with each other, it seems that they have a very close bond. A great example of that would be the Ape Canyon story where, a group of miners was out there. They killed one of these things, and the next night, all of the Sasquatch friends or family or whoever they were came back to the cabin and started tormenting these miners because it seemed like they were a little, angry that their friend was killed, right? So there seems to be somewhat of a camaraderie. You hear them talking to each other, making vocalizations toward one another. They're social animals, just like we are, just like other apes, the thought of them burying their dead is probably very possible. And then when you think about your dog or your cat, when an animal gets sick, even a human, right? We kind of curl up in a corner. We're not out in the open, right? When you have the flu, you don't go lay in the middle of your street, right? You kind of curl up on the couch. When your dog is sick, they might go under the bed or, so they probably retreat a little further into the woods when they're not feeling well or when they're starting to pass away.
That's a very good point you bring up about, what animals do when they go to die, quite frankly. Awesome thought process there. I really appreciate that. Now let's talk a little bit about your kind of Adirondack research, because I know you come up here often to research in the ADK. Tell us a little bit about that, kind of like the areas you like to go to, and kind of give us a little understanding as to what you're experiencing out there in the vast blue line.
Sure. So, as you know, I contacted you a couple of months ago to ask for some advice on some trails a little further up in the Adirondacks, because I'm typically working in the southern Adirondack region and the foothills of the Adirondacks. But I have really enjoyed researching in this area because just the resources, and I love the fact that the Adirondacks kind of marries nature and people. And so you have this dynamic where it seems like the wildlife kind of just coexists with the people. And so I think it's a really great place to research Sasquatch because, they may not be so shocked if they see you out there, right? I mean, they probably see people from time to time. You have a lot of major trails that sort of, coincide with some reports. And so I really enjoy researching, all over the Adirondacks, really. I'm kind of trying to find my permanent spot because I think with Sasquatch research, it's really important to find sort of one central valley or a certain mountain range that you're working over and over again to create consistency, to mark down data, and then to also sort of get those Sasquatch used to you being there and maybe kind of do the same thing that Dr. Jane Goodall did, where you get them so used to you that they don't really care if you're right near them. Now that's a really big undertaking, and it's probably very unlikely, but that's sort of my goal, is to get to a point where I can be out there. But what I'm working on now is a big undertaking, a big project involving mapping. So a lot of the resources that we have, BFRO.net, we have Scott Tompkins' Bigfoot Mapping Project, we have a couple of other websites where people can submit their reports. But with these sources, it's not easy to vet all of these reports. A lot of them are footprint reports, vocalization reports, and those are really hard to gauge credibility because sometimes people just get excited and they may mistake a coyote sound for a Sasquatch, or they may mistake a rabbit track for a Sasquatch footprint. And so I really want to focus just on sightings, because with a sighting, the way the person describes it, if they put an exact location, you can kind of figure out the credibility of that sighting. So I have access to some off the radar reports, and I've been taking those and combing through each one, looking at the location the witness put, some landmarks that they may have mentioned, and pinpointing the exact location of that sighting in the Adirondacks. And then what I'm doing is I'm looking at the visual description of the Sasquatch. Was it black? Was it white? Was it red, blonde? Were there any identifiable features on its body? Any scars on its face, right? And then I will take an icon that is a little Sasquatch graphic, and I will place it on my map. And depending on the color of the Sasquatch, that's the color of the icon. So I have this big map, and you'll see, black Sasquatch here, a brown one here, a white one here. And when you do this, it really helps you to identify sort of how many Sasquatch might be in that valley. Because what's more likely, 2 white Sasquatch that were, seen 2 years apart in one valley, or one white Sasquatch that was seen twice, right? So we can sort of gauge the population numbers in the area, and that's what I've been really working on. So, if you'd like, I do have a report handy that really struck me that I'd be happy to read out.
100%. Let's hear it. Of course, I'm not going to let you come on the podcast and not tell us some stories that you've heard, and then I'll share some with you as well.
Oh, amazing. Well, this is one of my favorite stories. I found it recently. It didn't happen recently, but I came across it not too long ago. And a lot of people will ask me, do you know of any witnesses that saw a Sasquatch swimming? And so this report is very interesting. It happened in August of 2007 on Osita Lake.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know that lake?
Yep.
I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm...
Osita Lake, yep.
Osita, okay.
No.
Last summer, I was vacationing with my family on Osita Lake in Franklin County. We had a small cabin there for many years, and I have seen a lot of different wild occurrences over that time span. Last summer, in late August, I was sitting outside at a fireplace along the lake shore by myself, and I noticed something swimming in the lake. At first, I thought it was a deer, because I have seen several of them in the past. But at closer observation, I noticed the swimming object was almost all white and seemed to be paddling along like a human. I watched, and as it approached the shore, it stood erect. But it was not a man. It was some sort of very hairy animal. But again, totally white in color. It shook itself off as it stood on the lakefront. It must have been 6 or 7 feet tall, totally white and hairy like some sort of primate. I'm not quite sure what it was, but it was neither a human or a bear. Pretty interesting.
Wow. Oh, very interesting. So for those who don't know, Osita Lake it's in like Saranac Lake, connects Lake Flower, and Kawasa is another lake. Like it's in that kind of general area. So for, just so people have some context, it's basically the Saranac Lake area. Awesome. Super cool. Also, I love how in her story, she said very, very innocently, just like, yeah, it was this thing. Like, it kind of was like an ape. It was like a man, but it wasn't a man or wasn't an animal. It's like, I don't know. It's like, I think you do know what it was actually, but I love the innocence in the report of
yeah.
That, of telling the story.
James, it's interesting because a lot of reports are like that, where the person says, I don't really know what this is, but in the event that it is a Sasquatch, I'm reporting it here. So it's interesting. And there are lots of reports like that where the witness isn't sure. And actually, where I am now in New York State, I'm a little bit lower down than the Adirondacks, but there are still reports here too. Actually, my maintenance man, I was talking to him one day and, he came in my house, and of course I have Bigfoot footprints all over my walls. And I said to him, I just want you to know this is a Sasquatch foot. I don't have some sort of weird, feet obsession with people. But, he was laughing and he said, oh, Sasquatch, there are no Sasquatch here in New York. He goes, I've been a hunter my whole life. I've never seen one. I said, oh, okay, you sure you never seen anything weird? He goes, oh, something weird. Yeah, I've seen something weird. He said, I was chased out of the woods by a white gorilla. And I said, what? And he starts telling me this story about him and his cousin. They were out hunting, and all of a sudden they heard something paralleling them, very heavy breathing, heavy footfalls. And when they looked, it was a large, upright, white gorilla. They ran out of there. And I said, there are no gorillas here in New York State, let alone white ones. That was Sasquatch.
That's amazing. What are the odds too that person in particular had that story too, and also just came into that story thinking like this doesn't exist. What's it actually do? Not only as you and I believe they absolutely exist, but you've had an encounter with one that anybody would be actually pretty psyched to experience. Yeah. Maybe not so much. People ask me all the time, like, oh man, people will send me, I'll get a message about some sort of Bigfoot thing every couple of weeks on social media from someone, whether it's a joke or like, just someone sending me a meme, whatever. Always ask, like, do you want to see one? And my answer is always, when I'm out in the woods, I do not want to run across one. In a car, roadside crossing all day long. Not when I'm out, in the Santanoni Range or the Seward Range, like, I do not want to come face to face with that. You are a sitting duck out there. But, that's quite a story. Unbelievable. Now, what was his response when you said like that's exactly what it was?
Well, now he's very excited and, he follows along on my Facebook, and he always, every time I see him, he says, I've been looking, but I haven't seen anything, so, but see, that's really important, right? To validate someone's experience, especially if they're not sure what they saw. Because a lot of times you will have witnesses that say they've seen Sasquatch twice or even multiple times. And although a lot of them are maybe not as credible,
yeah.
It's probably pretty rare to see one that many times. I do think some of those stories hold credibility because once you see a Sasquatch, it becomes part of your mental roster of animals, right? And you may be more likely to see one again. I think there are plenty of situations where people are walking through the woods and walk right past one, but because it blends in with the trees and they don't know what they're looking for, they just don't notice it. Whereas a deer or, a bear is sort of part of our mental database.
Sure.
We know that when we see that silhouette, that shape, we can connect it to an animal, right? But Sasquatch are very elusive. They're good at blending in with their surroundings. So I think if you see one once, you do have a good chance of seeing one again because now you know what you're looking for.
Yeah, 100%. Also, too, in terms of, not looking for it, a hunter would say, oh, I've never seen it. I'm out there hunting all the time. Well, but if you're not looking for it, of course, you're not going to see it. How many times, for anyone who hunts, how many times you've been walking around the woods, like literally deer hunting, and then you've walked right past a deer because they blend in so perfectly, or it took you a minute to actually finally see it and you're literally looking for it. And how many deer are there, in the world, even literally, I kid you not, earlier this week, I'm walking down my trail in my woods, going to my trail camera, to see some pictures on my trail camera. I walked right past 3 doe that were just like dead silent. They were literally 15 yards from me. Didn't see them until after I heard them. As I walked past, I heard like the twig snap, turned around and looked. It's like they were literally standing right next to me. I didn't even process them. And that's deer, right? Like, let's take something that really doesn't want to be seen, and also kind of somewhat looks like a tree. So you have that kind of going for it. So what has been your, let's say, favorite Bigfoot story? And it doesn't have to be in the ADK. It could be anywhere. What is your favorite story that you've come across in terms of an encounter story?
Okay, I've got a really good one for you, James.
Great. Lay it on me.
This takes place in Whitehall, New York.
Oh, hot damn. Here we go.
Oh, yeah. And it is a really, really cool story. So let me actually pull it up here because it's better if it's probably better if I just read it out to you.
Perfect.
But before my favorite, I will say, this mapping project has really opened my eyes to a lot of things. There's a report along Lake Bomoseen in Vermont, and a gentleman had an apple orchard, and he got a picture of what looks to be a Sasquatch on his trail camera. And on the back of the Sasquatch, there are patches of hair that are either discolored or missing. And I thought that was really interesting when I first saw the picture. And I met this gentleman at the Whitehall Sasquatch Calling Festival, and he seemed very credible. He talked about this experience. Something was taking apples off of his tree, and he put a trail camera out to see what it was. And it turns out he got this picture. Well, as I was doing this project, I found another report only a couple of years apart from this trail camera footage. And this person saw a Sasquatch that was dark brown with lighter pinkish patches of hair that covered its whole body. So they were sort of describing maybe the same Sasquatch. And it was only, about maybe 20 miles away from each other, a few years apart. That's on the New York border. So really interesting to see certain patterns and, identify sort of the same Sasquatch. That's been an interesting experience. Okay, now this is my favorite story. There was this gentleman who was going out to hunt a very elusive bird. And him and his friend were guided by this older gentleman. And And, they're out looking for this bird, and I don't know if they ever ended up finding any to shoot, but they were hunting. And the gentleman mentioned something about like these feral people. And so the guy goes, "What are you talking about?" And he goes, "I'll show you. Come out with me tomorrow and I'll show you these people I'm talking about. They're crazy, they're feral, whatever." So this guy says, 3 days ago, I went back with the old timer who was going to show me snipe hunting. Snipe, I think, is what he was. Yes, there is a snipe and you really do hunt it. He showed me some places and what to look for and took me through the marches to flush some snipe. And he said to never go in this march alone ever, for any reason, and to carry a gun that would stop a bear. I figured he was kidding. But he said he was serious and that there were people that would kill you and eat you as soon as they look at you. They were wild men and they were bred there for hundreds of years, living in the swamps and caves and cliffs. I thought maybe he was an inbred nut, and he asked me if I wanted to see one so that I would know that he wasn't kidding. He pulled us through the marsh to the edge of a field, and the grass is really high there, up to my chest, and I'm 6 feet tall. He made a weird whoop call, and it made the hair on my back raise up. Well, I'll be damned if something didn't stand up in the grass. The grass was right around belly high on it, where the belly button would be. So it was at least a good foot taller than me, maybe even 2. I couldn't be sure because it could have been standing on a rock or in a hole, but it was wide. That's all I know. I played football in high school, and this thing was as wide as anyone ever wearing pads. I shined my light on it, and it screamed and moved towards us. The old timer yelled at me, "What did you do that for, you idiot?" He called me. "I didn't tell you to do nothing with a light." And then he was pulling for all he was worth until we hit the river. He didn't stop until we were way out, and then he tore me a new one. He said these wild people are always trying to provoke a fight. They now know what a gun is and will try to get you to use it. He was in Vietnam for 4 years and said it is a trick that a lot of his fellow soldiers used to use. They will draw your attention and then flank you. He says he knows they are not in the area year-round, but he has no idea where they go. He has seen them on the mountain where he lives and in the marshes a lot. And he said if you ever want to piss your pants, go to this marsh and walk around at night when the frogs are calling. Warm nights are better, but the fog is worse. He said he's seen them in winter too, still naked on their feet, and that they were even more aggressive, and he thinks that they eat what they can, but they don't try to eat the turtles. So they can't be that starving. He said they definitely eat people because they're trying to make your attention, to make you fire at them, and then they'll turn around and you'll see the flankers. He said once you make eye contact and let them know who you are, they get pissed and throw rocks.
That is, wow, that is a story right there, man.
Isn't that interesting?
I have just so many questions for this man, for both of them, really, at this point. When was that? What was the year of that? Did you catch that?
That one was September of 2008. And it's right outside of Whitehall. It's right in that area.
Sure.
And, it's really interesting because, again, this person, this old timer, he's calling them, these people. He's not saying that they are Sasquatch. He's saying that they're these naked people. And so, I think on the East Coast, the word Sasquatch or Bigfoot, it's just really not as popular as on the West Coast. It's not as well known or well used. I mean, I meet a lot of people here that don't even know what it is.
Sure.
So very interesting that he was referring to them as a group of naked, sort of wild people.
Yep. No, very interesting. Also, too, I just know this just from listening. Obviously, I listen to big fan of the Sasquatch Chronicles podcast, and anytime the host talks about the Northeast, he so often says that people's encounters in the Northeast, so Bigfoot have kind of slightly different looks throughout the country in different areas. And he says that encounters in the Northeast, from what people report when they're telling him, is that they tend to be more man-like in terms of their appearance compared to, in the southern region of the United States. They tend to be more ape-looking down there, but more man-looking in the Northeast. Yeah. So that's completely right on par with what his research has shown to. Oh my gosh, it gave me chills as you were telling that story. Also, too, it's like you could picture, as you were reading this story, I'm kind of picturing that scene from Jaws when Quint is talking about the sharks and when all of the guys were in the, talking like this. Like, I can just picture this old timer telling this story that is absolutely terrifying, but he lived it. So it's totally different. And
I love how he was so casual about it. Like, he's just like, come on, you want to see these things? And, you hear so many stories like that. I've come across a lot of stories where, people are just casually coexisting with these things and they just don't think anything of it. They don't realize that, if all you have to do is capture one or shoot one and there you are, you're the star of the world.
Yeah. So that's the really thing too, is like there's and again, it's a rabbit hole. Like, once you go down deep, and you don't even need to go very deep to see that there's actually a lot of substance to this subject matter, which is why it's so fascinating. There's people who have them on their property, and it's just, they're on my property. And when you think about it, to these people, it's like, wait, these things that we're told don't exist, and why would they tell us they exist? At this point, like, they got to maintain the lie. There's no benefit to Sasquatch actually being real. So why would they, they as in, like, I guess, like, the powers that be have no benefit to saying, yes, they actually are out there. But people who have them on their property, to them, it's just this nuisance that's there. But it's like, dude, you realize you have something on your property that we're told doesn't exist, but they don't want anything to do with. They don't want anything to do with that whole subject, because they just see it as this giant nuisance of, like, no, they exist. They're here. But it's so fascinating when people can talk about it so casually like that, because it is not that crazy to them, because they've experienced it. And to me, those are the encounters. Those are the stories that, to me, are why I say 100%, zero doubt in my mind that they're out there. Because what does that person have to gain from this here? They have only things to lose by talking about it. And yet here they are talking about it because it's there. And I also find regarding this subject, like, when you have these, let's say, hunters, for example, who live in the woods, they'll, that's all they love to do is hunt, and then they'll never go in the woods again. And they're like, I don't care if you believe me, you weren't there. This is what happened. I'm never going back in the woods. That is so much more powerful to me than anything, because there's so much context to what this person saw. And what they experienced out there, to say, like, who am I to say that, no, you didn't, because clearly you were affected and impacted by this in an enormous way. Real quick, as we start to wrap things up, I want to go through, just for fun, let's have a little fun. I want to go through different areas that you've heard Bigfoot stories, and then I'll tell a couple areas in the park, all in the Adirondacks, where I've heard of stories that have taken place, just so people who are listening who know they go camp here, they camp there, they hike there, they can know, like, oh, these two people on this podcast have heard of Bigfoot encounters and Bigfoot stories in this area. So I'll let you go first. What are different kind of parts of the park that you've just heard or read about encounters happening?
It's interesting, because when I look at my map, I see encounters spread all across the Adirondack region. Sure. I think, really your best bet is to find an area with a water source and a lot of cover, not a lot of tourism or not a lot of people around.
That's like the whole park right there.
Yeah, right.
Counter, water, or cover and water. It's basically like the entire park.
Exactly. I mean, you really can't go wrong in the Adirondacks. I see so many reports all over my map, and it's really hard to confine them to one area. But I will say some of my favorite reports come out of the Sacandaga Lake and River region near, Wells, New York, Hope, New York. I've done a little bit of my own research over there, and I really think that's a good area. I think that There's not really too many, it's not very commercialized over there. There's not really a lot of houses, and you can get pretty deep into those trails. I think that's a really good area to start if someone were to, go and look for Sasquatch. But honestly, I think the best thing you could do, be as safe as you can, but get in the car in the wee hours of the morning or night, have a dash camera, and drive the roads of the Adirondacks wherever you live there, because I think, it's a good bet that you might see one crossing the road.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. I would love to see that map at some point here.
Yeah.
That would be fascinating to me. And actually, I have in my book, which actually just is sitting right here, I have a Sacandaga River story right in that book about a Bigfoot encounter. I'm sure you've heard, we probably talked about it, you and I, but I have heard of stories in literally at the base of the Cascade Lakes on Cascade Mountain for all of you hikers, right at the base of Cascade Mountain. That's from the BFRO website. I've heard of stories, even growing up, heard of stories out in the Paul Smiths area along that Route 3 to Malone. I think it's Route 3 to Malone. Multiple stories back then. And there's even, you had a guest on your podcast who was then also on my podcast and is now a buddy of mine. Shout out to Gunnar from Long Island. Hope to go hunting with you again this year. Crazy stories out on Keys Mills Road in Paul Smiths. And if you ever go out there, I mean, it is back there. I mean, it is, you want to get on one of the most remote parts of the park, you drive Keys Mills Road, and it's just this never ending like dirt road that's just taking you deeper and deeper into the wilderness. So not surprising that there's been multiple, it's also swampy, multiple encounters back there. I remember maybe like a couple years ago, because I'm always like posting in Facebook groups, ADK Facebook groups. If you've had a, encounter, shoot me a message. And not surprising, some people don't want to come on a podcast. Not super surprising. Sometimes they will, but I've seen people in passing talk about, say, the Five Ponds Wilderness was basically, someone was like, oh, the Five Ponds Wilderness, that's Bigfoot country. Be very careful if you're out there. And I sent them a message, and the response is, yeah, I experienced something out there. I can't really talk about it. It gets me too upset. Boom, right there. It's like when you hear that, you say, oh, crap, there is something out there. And that if it was too upsetting to even just retell the story, just like in a message to someone, and a very credible person explained that. So let me tell you, as we start to wrap things up, I'm going to tell you a story that's probably going to blow your mind a little bit, and probably get the podcast shut down because there's state involvement in this story. So I won't say which state organization, because who knows what Men in Black will show up at my house after I tell this story. But so a buddy of mine, big Adirondack hiker, great dude. He was having a conversation once with we'll just say a state employee who works for a part of the state that finds themselves in the woods. Let's just say that. That's all I'll say. I didn't say anything about what organization within the state. So they got a call. She was telling him this story. She got a call that someone was reporting that they just shot a Bigfoot. And this was in like central Adirondacks, central southern. So actually kind of around that like Northville, Sacandaga area, that they shot a literal Bigfoot, and it's in their cabin because they brought it back to their like cabin, their hunting cabin. And the woman was like, on the phone, was like, okay, I don't know what to make of this. So she said, okay, let me put you on hold. And she put the guy on hold. The guy was hysterical. He was like, I don't know what to do. He was kind of like freaking out a little bit. And again, I'm hearing this story secondhand, but this is exactly what I was told by a very credible person. And then she has the guy on hold, and she goes to her kind of like superior and says, hey, I've got this guy on the phone talking about he shot a Bigfoot, and it's like on their property right now. And he told her, okay, immediately hang up the phone call. So she hung up the call. And then after, she asked him, like, what's the deal there? And he told her, this is exactly what he told her, that we know they exist. They are out there. We want nothing to do with it. And we don't want this to have been reported to us, because we also know they come for their dead, and the state wanted nothing to do with this. So hence, hang up the phone. It doesn't get logged. It doesn't get anything, but that was directly from somebody who was higher on the food chain out of his mouth. So take it for what you will, take that story for what you will, but that is what was told, and fascinating story. But yeah, I guess with that, we'll start to wrap up this episode. So before we wrap things up, I like to ask people a bunch of questions to wrap up the show. So a lot of times we talk about hiking, but what's something for you that you always have with you? And you'll have a very unique answer for this. What's something that you always have with you when you go out into the woods that's unique to you? And we'll kind of make it like Bigfoot themed. Like, what do you always have to have with you when you're out there?
I always have to have an audio recorder. I
Awesome.
did hear some vocalizations out in the Mount Hood National Forest, and I was able to record them, which was amazing. And I can listen to those recordings and I can study them. So that's really important for me.
Awesome.
And a tape measure in case I ever see a footprint. I do keep plaster and a bucket in the back of my car in case I have to cast anything. And sometimes if it's a longer hike, it goes in my backpack, and I get a real good shoulder workout because that plaster can be pretty heavy.
Sure.
But I like to keep an audio recorder and a tape measure. I think that's probably the best thing you can have if you want to get into Bigfooting. You can find them on Amazon really, really cheap.
Very cool. Very cool. I actually have one of your orange Bigfoot flags in my van, literally, as we speak.
Amazing.
So I have one of those. Second question.
Mm-hmm.
What makes the Adirondacks a unique place from your perspective and for the reasons that you like to get outdoors?
Well, I would say the Adirondacks are accessible. There are a lot of trails. If you're a beginner person, right? Like I grew up just outside of New York City, so I was not this amazing, accomplished hiker when I started getting into Bigfoot, and I'm still not. I asked you for some tips on remote hiking because I don't typically do, really deep backcountry hiking. But
Sure.
I think the good thing about the Adirondacks is you have both. You can go in the backcountry and be in the middle of nowhere, or you can take a trail that's a little more traveled, and you have just as much of a chance of coming across Sasquatch evidence or a Sasquatch themselves, because when you look at the reports plotted on the map, plenty of people are seeing them in, trails that are, I wouldn't say high traffic, but trafficked enough that you may run across another person. So it's nice to know that you can park at a trailhead and go Bigfooting for the day without having to go to a really remote, sort of scary, desolate area. And I think that's where the Adirondacks has an advantage, because you can sort of have both. You can have that backcountry, you can have those, shorter hikes. Actually, one of my favorite reports in the Adirondacks comes over near the Moose River Plains area, and somebody saw this thing on a trail, and I hiked that trail, and I came across several people, and there were houses in the area. So I think the good thing is the Adirondacks really marries people and nature. And so nature may be a little more comfortable around people. And so you may have a little bit more of a chance of seeing a Sasquatch because they may have seen people before. Just one of my theories.
Sure. Fantastic theory. And then finally, my final question is, why do you go outdoors and do this? So why are you out there Bigfooting? Why are you going out into the woods and putting yourself in, potential harm's way, right? Over this, kind of this research and this desire to learn more. Why are you doing it?
I don't know if anyone's ever asked me that. I like that question. I don't know if I've ever asked myself that. I think that I just have a really big sense of adventure. I love to solve mysteries, and this is probably the last great mystery that we have on this earth. If Sasquatch is discovered, man, that's going to be a really life-changing experience. And, for me, I look at it as an opportunity for conservation. If we discover Sasquatch, I'm really hoping that that's a positive experience for the species, and not a negative one. But I think, the more that I can educate people, right, and engage them with my content of me going out and looking for Sasquatch, the more that I can educate people on the nature of Sasquatch, the less of the blow there'll be when there's a discovery, because they have been painted as a monster in a lot of movies and TV shows, right? And so I want to teach people, no, this is a biological animal, maybe a little more, but this is something that's out there in the woods, just like a bear, just like a moose, just like a mountain lion. You have to treat them with respect. You have to be cautious around them, just like any other predator. But at the end of the day, they are just, out there, and they're not a monster, and they can get aggressive, but so can a bear. So that's why I go out and do it, because I'd really like to discover the species and, make an impact on the world and sort of, inspire conservation efforts and, teach people to respect animals and especially predators.
I love it. Now you have a bigger role now with the Whitehall Bigfoot Festival. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, the Whitehall Festival is so much fun. Unfortunately, it's not really near any major airports. So it is a little bit tricky for folks out of state to get to. But if you are in New York State, I highly recommend it. We have thousands of people coming to the festival. I organize all the speakers, and we have a really great lineup of local New York State researchers, anywhere from Western New York to the Adirondacks to the Hudson Valley. We have researchers speaking about anything from field gear to personal experiences. Actually, the police officer in Whitehall, New York, who saw the Sasquatch at close range, speaks every year and tells his story. And it's just a fabulous event. We have all sorts of Sasquatch vendors. You can come up to the speakers. I'm one of the speakers too. And you can come up, we can have a conversation. You can tell me your story. It is just such a great event. And it's a great way to network with other witnesses and sort of hear people's stories.
Awesome. Yeah, I've been. I didn't get to go this year. I went last year. It's a fun time for anyone that wants to go and just have a good old time. It's a fun experience. So, Emily, where can people find you online?
They can find me at theforestfleur.com or the Forest Fleur on Instagram. That's FLEUR. I do have some Bigfoot merch, some field gear, and lots of resources and information on my website. There is a page on my website that I recently added, and you can check out local Adirondack Sasquatch there. I gave them all names. I put the locations, so you can check that out and see if any of them are near you.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and being the guest on Bigfoot in the Blue Line Part 5 here on the October sessions. But that's going to wrap up this edition of the 46 of 46 podcast. Check out all of Emily's pages. And then when you got time after that, head over to 46outdoors.com to check out what I have to offer, from books to ebooks to training programs and everything else to get you ready to explore the outdoors here in the Adirondacks and beyond. But check back on Fridays this month for more October sessions right here on the 46 of 46 podcast. We got lots of spooky, fun content coming your way. But that'll do it. Remember to always leave no trace, do the rock walk, and if you carry it in, carry it out. See you on the trails, everybody.